So let's welcome David.
I am standing at the corner of Orchard and Delancey outside of the Tenement Museum in Lower Manhattan. I've been looking forward to this visit, thinking I'd learn about the immigration from Eastern Europe at the beginning of the 20th century that brought me here. My grandfather came to Ellis Island in 1924. My daughter found this out when she visited a few years ago and found him on the database. He came from Russia on a ship that left from France. That same daughter is now a local New Yorker, actually a Brooklynite. She's brought us tickets for this tour. Mom, sister, and I are visiting, and we're taking a tour called Under One Roof, where we will learn about families that lived in this building on their arrival to New York and the U.S. from the 1950s to the 1980s. The era when my grandfather came, well, it's on a different tour. Our tour guide, Mary Beth, is part docent, part storyteller, and part educator. She tells us about the building through stories of actual families that lived there, including the Epsteins, survivors of the Holocaust, the Velezes, who were migrants, not immigrants, because they were already citizens. They came from Puerto Rico, and the Wongs, who came from China. Their stories are told with artifacts and recordings and pictures as we walk through the small apartment in which they'd all lived at different times. We walked through the crowded streets of Lower Manhattan after the tour, and we found a pub where we could all share the feelings that we'd unearthed. My heart and my head had been stirred, and surrounded by my family, I was ebullient. My older daughter was checking her phone, and she sees that around the time that we went on the tour, a man had entered a synagogue in Pittsburgh, a couple of blocks from the home of some dear friends, and he had opened fire. She found this out from the social media feed of the daughter of those friends, saying that their family had been okay. We sat in silence, trying to process this in the context of the glow that we had brought with us from the museum. The shooter had killed 11 people. He hated Jews in the HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, an organization that had long assisted people trying to make it to the United States from places where they were in danger. That organization had helped the parents of another friend enter the U.S. Those parents, like the Epsteins, had survived the Holocaust. I'm sitting in a cafe the next day, reading the paper, trying to absorb all of this. And I'm reading a story in the paper about a caravan of people fleeing violence in their Central American homes, hoping to find refuge in the United States. The president, he sees them as invaders. He's intent on stopping them. I see desperate people coming here with the hope of a new life. They seem to me much like the Epsteins, the Velezes, and the Wongs. They seem like my grandfather, William Barish, who was named Der Barendicker until somebody at Ellis Island gave him the shortened moniker that's on my driver's license. I see myself as an American. I'm one of those privileged white people who doesn't fear getting deported, getting rough treatment from the authorities, but the shooter at the Tree of Life synagogue, he gives me pause. Will I be looking around for an exit the next time I'm at Beth Emmet, my synagogue in Evanston? Will I be wondering how to escape an active shooter? Will I be figuring out how to save one of the more elderly in the congregation? Will I have my mind on spiritual pursuits or tactical ones? I'm reminded that there are those who think my kind doesn't belong here, even though I have a nice job, a nice house, and a nice passport, declaring that I can cross borders whenever I want. I always thought that the Holocaust couldn't happen here. And I always thought that my friend whose parents were aided by HIAS, after they'd survived Hitler's horror, he was over concerned when he talked about anti-Semitism. And now, I think I was foolish to see his vigilance as such. I can't deny that there are haters out there. Dangerous haters. A number of months later, I see a cross-section of faces, and I can imagine that I can see descendants of the Epsteins, the Velezes, and the Wongs. I'm crowded into a gymnasium at the MCC Mosque in Morton Grove. Over 1,000 of us are in this little personal space, and we listen to a variety of religious and political speakers. This is a vigil to support the local Muslim community after another hate-filled white man has entered a house of worship. This time it had been a mosque in New Zealand, and the number of people killed is horrifying, and it's hard to comprehend. I walk out of the mosque, though, feeling that I've seen the faces of true Americans, and I'm inspired and yet mindful that this vigil took place in a bubble of tolerance, in a bubble of understanding in a complex country that's home to us, but also to many who fear others. The president, he seems to play up that fear to his supporters. That fear of others is blocking people fleeing oppression in Central America at our southern border. And this fear has lodged in some, and it only takes one, who let that fear metastasize into violent outbursts of hate. A few weeks later, another shooter filled with hate has entered a synagogue in San Diego, and I am bouncing between feeling vulnerable and insulated with each news cycle. I can't help but see myself in the stories of the Epsteins, in the Velezes, in the Wongs, and in the Muslim community, and in the refugees at the southern border, in my grandfather who had a small grocery, a bodega on the west side in the early 20th century, and who never quite got American culture and would yell, "Bullshit, bullshit," at the television set. I can self-define all I want. But some will look at me and see a privileged white guy. And others will look at me and see a Jew who should be silenced, who killed Christ, and who's stealing their money. And sometimes they don't even know that they've made me the other. Like my client, who I really liked, who once told me to Jew down the other lawyer. I think this duality, this feeling of being outside and inside, it isn't just my head. It's uniquely American, a land where the natives are outsiders, whose ancestors lost their land to the immigrants who now fashion themselves as the natives. I try to make sense of this. I try to make sense of this melting pot while pulling a coin out of my pocket that bears the inscription E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Thank you.